Good morning and welcome to Words That Matter. I'm Lee Smith, your host of Words That Matter, a modern day book club. Today, we're going to be joined by one of my favorite writers. I just want to talk about him for a second before I bring him on, so I'm going to brag on him a little bit. I started reading our next guest, Lee Harris. I don't know, it was right after 9/11, and he just wrote some incredibly important books. And I'm just going to hold up his three books, which I have right here on my bookshelves. And I use them as, well, first of all, he's a terrific prose writer. So I just like reading his prose for pleasure, but also his insight and his information, just fantastic. So, Civilization and Its Enemies, The Next Stage of History by Lee Harris. The Suicide of Reason, and this was a big 9/11, very important post 9/11 book. The Suicide of Reason, Radical Islam's Threat to the West. And here is his most recent book, The Next American Civil War, The Populist Revolt Against the Liberal Elite. And in it, Lee essentially predicted the coming of Donald Trump and the rise of the America First movement without having any idea that Donald Trump was going to rise to fill that role in American politics, in American society. Right now, Lee is under contract for a new book. He's at work writing on it. So today what we're going to do is we're going to get an insight into a writer at work. I want to talk about the subject of his book. We're going to talk about how he's going about writing it and what are the different procedures and processes he goes through to get his work done as a writer. So without further ado, welcome, Lee Harris. Thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Your new book, I just wanted to say, I forgot to say, I know you're not quite finished yet, but if you can, and the ideas will change a little bit through the writing, but if you can give us a general idea of what it's about.
The title of the book, you got stuck on reason there. The title of the book is What's Wrong with the Right Side of History. And this refers to the very common metaphor you hear, especially among liberal politicians, when they declare that implicitly that they, of course, are on the right side of history. And they also, at the same time, make it very clear that their enemies or opponents are on the wrong side of history. Now, the question to me is, where did this metaphor come from? Because it's obviously a metaphor. I was reminded of it yesterday when I heard Karine Jean-Pierre talking about the impeachment of Marx, where she declared that history will judge this. Okay, again, this use of the word history as if it's a personification of this thing called history. Where did this idea come from? And what happened with this book is what happened with all my other projects, where I feel kind of impelled to go back and look into the depths of where these ideas come from. And so what I started doing was kind of speculating about how the future was looked upon by people in the past. In the modern world, from the 19th century, we developed the notion the future is going to be brighter, better than the present, and a great improvement over the past. But if you look back in history, if you go back to the ancient Greeks would have found this concept just incomprehensible. For them, they were convinced, this is true of Hesiod, the poet, it was true of Plato, the philosopher, that the best days of mankind were way in the past, in what was called the Golden Age. And since that time, mankind had been constantly getting worse and worse and worse. The Romans, who were influenced by Greek thought, also felt the same thing. The poet Lucretius believed there had been some progress up into his own day, like man had discovered fire, its superior social organization, but it all stopped with Lucretius. This is about 2,200 years ago. With the coming of Christianity, a new notion of history, of the future, entered into the world, which was that God was in control of history. It's called the idea of divine providence, that he's looking after events. We can't predict what he's going to do, but we know that whatever he does, it will come out for the best. This idea basically held on tenaciously in the European mind until the coming of the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance is really the first movement in world history where a group of people look at the immediate past, that is the Middle Ages, and they regard their immediate past as a period of utter darkness, absolutely nothing's worth salvaging from the Christian Middle Ages for the men of the Renaissance. What they want to do, what they think of as the ideal future, is not to go to the future, but to go to the past, to revive the ideals of classical antiquity, to revive the Roman form of the Republic, for example, or to revive the Greek ideals of art and painting and sculpture. The Enlightenment, people often think the Enlightenment, the 18th century Enlightenment, was where the idea of progress first began. But in fact, if you look at the great Enlightenment thinkers, like take Hume, David Hume, or Voltaire, or Diderot, these people did not, they felt that, again, they felt that they had progressed from the Dark Ages, from the rule of the Roman Catholic Church, but they didn't really see a lot of hope for the future. Voltaire was a professional historian as well as being a famous wit. David Hume was more famous at his time for being a historian. And Edward Gibbon, of course, is probably the most famous of the three historians of that period. This is the Enlightenment. All believed mankind was pretty immutably rotten, that you couldn't really expect much from mankind, either in the present or in the future. The future would be kind of the same old of human wickedness and vice, etc. It's only at the period during the French Revolution, and you can point to one specific thinker, the Marquis de Condorcet, who in 1793, while he was being hunted by the French revolutionaries, by the way, for his own ideas, he published a book about human progress, where he laid out not only the steps of the past that had led to the present moment, but he laid out steps to the future that would lead to a better and brighter world. Not only a better and brighter world, but one in which human beings, through society, through correcting the old institutions, would become perfect. They would actually achieve perhaps immortality. The English novelist and philosopher William Godwin on the continent was also an enthusiast with the French Revolution, and he also made the same argument. Human beings could be perfected, and in fact, they could obtain immortality on this earth. So the 19th century introduced this wholly new concept of the future, and I call it the future revolution. This was not only embraced by people like Condorcet or Godwin, it became the leading doctrine of people like Charles Fourier, who was the famous utopian socialist. It became a chief tenet of Marxism. Karl Marx believed that history had moved through stages, like Hegel thought, but he also predicted history would move through future stages, each better. Capitalism, which had served its purpose, Marx thought capitalism was progressive, would be replaced by socialism. And the final stage should be communism, at which point history would come to an end. So these visionaries of the future had this idea that the future is where it's at. And I try to explain that in terms of the loss of faith in the Christian ideas that had permeated intellectuals in Europe to a great extent. People like Feuerbach, people like Marx, who were arguing that essentially, instead of having faith in God and divine providence, faith must now be centered on the future. The future is what you live for, it's what you died for, it's what you martyred yourself for the sake of the glorious days coming in the future. Okay, the American progressive movement accepted this idea. So did the social Darwinists. The social Darwinists believed that the evolutionary process itself guaranteed that the best races would triumph. The Nazis themselves, the National Socialists, believed in progress too. They believed that progress came only when the Aryans were in control. They looked back on history. This was Houston Stewart Chamberlain was the great philosopher of this idea, which is that only Aryans had contributed to civilization. Therefore, the best way to guarantee progress is giving Aryans supreme dominant power. And the best Aryans, of course, were the Germans themselves. So the 20th century curiously turned out to be a battle, a conflict between these different visions of the future. Because remember, the Bolsheviks had their own vision of the future, which was through revolution, eventually through global revolution. The final stage, you'd go past through the stages of socialism, and you'd end up in the workers' paradise. At the culmination of history, where history would come to an end. Now, all these visions assume that when mankind reached this final state, there would be nothing left to do. You would have century after century of harmonious, blissful peace and harmony. due to communism. Now, this itself is a little strange idea, and in the book I quote I use the famous novel by H.G. Wells, The Time Machine, as a demonstration. In The Time Machine, the unnamed narrator goes forward like hundreds of thousands of years into the future. He lands in this community where these beautiful young men and girls are just enjoying what looks like a revival of the golden age of the Greeks. You know, they're absolutely they're beautiful. They're in harmony. But then he observes something a little strange. One of the girls, this beautiful girl, falls in the river and is screaming for help, and nobody even turns around. And he suddenly realizes that maybe this is not the golden future that socialism was predicted. And he discovers that the Morlocks are actually feeding these people. Morlocks live under the earth, and they provide these people with this ideal welfare state where they don't have to work, food's provided for them. But the problem is that, while Big Brother in Orwell just watches you, the Morlocks will eat you. They want to eat you. So they're breeding these people as cattle. So what I think, even though H.G. Wells was a confirmed and convinced socialist, I think as a novelist, he had an insight into a fallacy of socialism, which is if we could, in fact, achieve this perfect utopian world, what would happen to the human beings in it? Maybe human beings need struggle. Maybe we need conflict in order to keep from relapsing into mindless sheep. And I think this is the real lesson that he suggests in his novel, which really contradicts his own doctrinaire theory of Fabian socialism. And this now brings us to the American progressives. As the title, when somebody says, I'm a progressive, what are they saying? Is this an ideology?
When we're talking about, because I just want to go back and identify, you said it, I just want to make clear
Yes.
that sort of the origin, the origins of progressivism seem to be, as you're saying, that the origins of progressivism come out of the French Revolution. That's the idea, that's where it's born, the idea of men becoming, or the secular idea, men becoming perfectible, reaching a perfect stage. This starts with the French Revolution. I just wanted to make it clear because that's a fascinating piece of history, which I didn't know. So I just wanted to underscore that. And so that's where we pick it up with the American progressives. But you know what? I just want to say that let's take a break for 1 minute, and let's pick it up with that after our break. If you're watching on YouTube, please make the jump with us to Epoch TV exclusively, having a fantastic conversation with the brilliant Lee Harris, talking about the book that he is working on right now. What is wrong with the right side of history? He's working on it right now, and we're talking about it right now. We're going to start talking about it again right after the break. So make sure you make the jump with us to Epoch TV exclusively. See you in less than a minute.
I think a big part of 1984 was that regular citizens were reporting other citizens for disobeying, for going against narrative, for speaking out. In a lot of what we thought were civilized free countries, where neighbors were calling the police if, for instance, there were more than 4 people, more than 6 people in your home. We were shifting by lockdowns the burden of the disease to the so-called essential workers crowd, which are the people working in the grocery stores, the people cleaning the toilets in the hospital, the people that are delivering for Amazon, while the affluent are sitting at home uninterrupted, right, for the most part, getting their full salary, working on their laptop. So there was this is unethical for public health guidance to shift the burden of a disease to poor people. They got away with it to a great extent because of the very effective use of censorship of opposing views and demonization of opposing views, so that this sort of propaganda, where it marginalized anyone who spoke against a narrative, became very effective. And that is a tactic that was actually used very, very much so in 1984. Orwell wrote the book at a time as a warning about the appeal of totalitarianism to elites and intellectuals at the time in the late 1940s.